Evaluating field gathered data. So you've been out in the field, you've gathered information, you've done your field work, you've done your measurements, you've looked at particular areas, you've observed, you've taken photographs. Now you've got to bring back all that information back to the classroom, back to wherever it is you do your work. Bring it all together, make judgments, and then follow on with the other steps in the project. So today we're going to look at evaluating field gathered data. What does this word evaluate mean? Well, that's obviously an important one. Now, the HSC Glossary of Terms on the Board of Studies website states that to evaluate is to make a judgment based upon specific criteria. So a judgment, it's like we are a jury, or it's like we are the judge handing down a judgment. Now, a lot of the time, these judges or juries make judgments based upon laws, and that's the criteria. Now, we're not looking at whether people are guilty or innocent today, but rather you'll be either looking at 11 trail design principles from Module 1 if you are maintaining sustainable mountain bike trails, or you'll be evaluating a specific area based upon whether it's whether it's lagging behind or meeting some of the things that are going on globally in current trends in cycling infrastructure. So that's our criteria. That's what we're evaluating. And to what level is it achieving those things or not achieving those things? So using specific language, outstanding, excellent, satisfactory, poor, etc., that sort of language is going to become important and imperative. Now let's look at this particular principle from the 11 principles of mountain bike trail design. So the first video we looked at, we need to locate tracks on the side of a hill. Now you might have been out in the field, gathered some data, you use your clinometer to identify a slope, you're able to judge that you're on the side of the hill, and you noted that a trail wasn't really located on this side of the hill. Rather, it ran directly downhill, and that caused lots of issues. It causes some of the issues for some of the other principles as well. You took a photo of that, you geotagged that photo, you identified it on a map. Now you can bring that back to the classroom and then you can evaluate. So the data, the information is showing us that, well, this particular trail doesn't really meet the criteria. So maybe it's a poor example of trail design. Now this sort of language, combining that language with your own evaluation based upon the criteria, is what we have to do. That is important. That's this whole step. It's looking at the information, reading through it, making a judgment based upon that criteria. So go back to the criteria, go back to the data you've collected, make those judgments. Now, those judgments might need to be in a written form. It might be in a table. It might be dot points. That sort of specifics. You need to look at the project or the thing that you have to actually do. What's been asked of you? Have you been asked by council to create a written report? Have you been asked to create an annotated map with areas that need improvement? So go back to your task specifics, look at exactly what you need to do. So when evaluating, it can be a little hard sometimes. But first things first, obviously you need to collect and collate the field data before you can do any evaluating or any evaluation. Ensure that you're familiar with the criteria. In this case, let's use the 11 trail design principles. So some questions you need to ask yourselves. These are the types of questions that you should be able to answer yes, no, maybe, not sure. If you're not sure, maybe you haven't collected enough information. So have a read through those questions, and those questions relate to the 11 principles of trail design. And remember, these will help you make evaluations. So does the data show that all of the trails are outsloped, or maybe not? We've got some areas indicated by these photos that show that trails are insloped, causing significant pooling of water and erosion in some areas. So what data do we use to evaluate? So maybe you took some field measurements. Maybe you have a GPX file which indicates that you've got an average gradient of 15% for a particular extended climb. And that might mean that it's quite difficult for people to ascend that particular area, or it might be an area that has significant erosion. You've used multiple things to identify that area. You might have identified it on a map. You might have taken a photograph of that. You might have a field measurement of the clinometer reading stating that it's 15 degrees or 15% in that area. You might have made some field notes, just some quick annotations, some dot points. You might have some vertical imagery from the drone showing areas that are of significant risk to erosion. You might have also, when we come to urban cycling, you might have looked at some secondary sources of information looking at urban cycling infrastructure in Port Macquarie. Some other things as well that you can use to evaluate data recorded is surveys. Now, when we are looking at urban cycling infrastructure in Port Macquarie as one of the projects that you can choose to do, you might decide to conduct a simple survey using Google Forms. So looking at that data, what does it show? You might have some quantitative information that shows that, well, 60% of people don't feel safe when they're commuting to work in Port Macquarie. Well, what does that suggest? That suggests that we need to do something about safety. So using the information that you have, that you've collected, to make evaluations based upon that specific criteria is what you are doing. So making these evaluations can be difficult sometimes. Now, what I've provided for you here is an example of maybe a way that you might want to lay out an evaluation of sustainable mountain bike trails. We have here a table which identifies the 11 principles, and we're stating at what sort of level is Wayne Richards Park currently at. So I've just made these up, of course, you'll need to do it yourself, but you can have different descriptors. Descriptors are these words that we use to say whether something's of a really high quality or really low quality and in between. It's important to have really good descriptors that are clear, that are universally understood by different people, and that you can note down. So I've obviously identified that, okay, so Wayne Richards Trails, and this is obviously based upon and just done this myself, so this isn't reflective of where it's at, but so it's meeting principle number 6, obviously to a high standard, whereas number 8, it has clay soils present, which means there's some issues there, and I've made some field notes as well, and maintenance required, but it has great signage, as we can see, which means that it's meeting to an excellent standard, principle number 11. So figuring out a way that you can evaluate in a clear and understandable and cohesive, logical manner is a good thing. So using something like this might be an idea. And if you chose to do, or you're thinking of choosing urban cycling infrastructure, same thing again. So what's the criteria? We'll put that down the left-hand side, and then these descriptors used to identify how it's going. So as you can see here, if we would just make a quick judgment, not doing too well. You might also like to provide a bit of a score for this so that you can give it a rating, a quantitative figure, something that you can actually count, that you can create a chart or a table. Everyone likes charts and tables, particularly in reports, and that sort of visual data, visual information, visual communication is really powerful, and especially when it's used in combination with written text. So there's some tips for evaluating. Evaluating, pretty difficult. It's one of these things that requires lots of brain power. But remember, go back to those basics. What's the criteria? What are the specifics of the task? You have good descriptors, these universally understood terms. And then again, structure. Structured in a way that's logical, cohesive. And if you do that, you'll be able to create a really good evaluation.